Good morning, good day, good evening, greetings and salutations. And might I also add a little bit of welcome to the Safe Room featuring security side quests. My name is Tristan Wadi, and I am joined by the mysterious, the great, the sage, Russ. How's it going?
Oh, it's going. It's been an eventful day.
Yeah. So for you who this is your first time on the Safe Room featuring security side quest, a little bit of background, a little bit of origin story. My name is Tristan Wadi, and what I do is a lot of security consulting. So I'm a senior security consultant that helps customers accelerate their journey to the cloud in a secure manner and fashion. And Russ, what is your origin story today?
My origin story is on the opposite side. I help customers contain and remediate their incidents. So, kind of after things go bad, you're a little bit of prevention, I'm a little bit
Yeah.
of cure.
So yeah, like fire and ice, or how do we put together that in the magic terms? I don't think that works out. It makes lightning, I think, right? Depending on what game you're playing. But for you who are joining in the chat, let us know where you're tuning in from. We'd like to know. Are you coming in from the East Coast, the West Coast, international? Always good to hear. And feel free to put it in. And if you have time, if you have the effort, and if you have the keyboard, might I add the second question that I will pose to chat when you're put in all of that information is, what is your favorite extreme sport? That is the question of the day. So I throw this to you first, Russ. What is your favorite extreme sport?
Let's see. So, for me, that would probably be a tie between snowboarding and mountain biking. I'm not good at either of them, but those are my extreme sports. So,
Yeah. I would say it's the effort that counts, right? And that you're here today as well. So that means you're doing just fine. Those are two great start off points that I am not going to follow you in, because I'm going the opposite route of, I would say, extreme food eating. And what I mean by that, I'm more of like the hot sauce type of person, right?
ooh.
We were talking earlier about ghost peppers and things of that nature, and I think that's a good starting point to a good lunch. But the second piece that I was always interested in is extreme ironing. Have you heard about this? Extreme ironing.
Is that a real
So,
thing?
yeah, essentially, you are combining extreme sports of, let's say, you climb to the top of a hill, you hike, you do all those things, then you break out an ironing board and you just iron on top of that mountaintop. So that I found that interesting. How did I get
That's
to
pretty
that?
great.
Yeah, rabbit holes that we go down. But I digress. I would like to hear anybody else who thinks it's cool, who thinks it's fun. Thank you for joining today, MD. But as we continue on, I think one of the things on this adventure that we're going on today is to kind of continue on from last week. So I think, Russ, do you want to just talk about, we started off with some security foundational items last week. What is the items that we need to know from, let's say, a cloud security standpoint? So, well, what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to go a little bit deeper. This is our advanced security architecture episode. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into probably similar services and tools that we talked about last week. And we'll kind of go a little bit into a bit, of the next level kind of. So, last week we were talking about securing our castle, but now we're specifically talking about securing the important stuff inside of our castle. So that's a little taste of kind of what we'll go into this episode.
Yeah, reinforcing the walls, putting a little bit more cement on it, building it a little bit higher, because I think last week we laid the foundation of, okay, it's a one level castle. But nobody is really looking at the one level castle. They want the mountain type,
the tiered,
right? The tiered approach. And I think that also kind of opens it up to the audience as well, to chat. So when you think of security architecture, what do you find most challenging? And I think we have a poll on that, and I think we can have a little bit of a deeper dive into that as well. But I think some of the different areas that we can add as we start to get the poll on up and running is defense in depth, least privilege, segmentation, identity management, continuous pieces of the puzzle. I think that is one of the items that we can go through. And let's see, as we bring it up, and the poll is not coming up, but I think we do have a foundation that we can go from. Is that security architecture principle, right, Russ? Is when you start to think about all these different items, and here it goes. Oh, so one of the things is, hey, when you have an organizational structure and you do security architecture reviews, we'll start there. How often do you do it? Russ, what have you been seeing?
So I have been seeing a lot of cases where they are choosing ad hoc, which would be basically anything that's not based off of time. So if it's like maybe at the beginning of a project, you're looking at actual architecture reviews, or after an incident, which is generally when I see it. That's when an architecture review comes up, which in my opinion is not ideal. I would like to go with maybe something more time-based, so that way before it becomes an issue. So I would say probably, in my opinion, it should be quarterly. But yeah, I've definitely seen people waiting until after their compromise to review their security posture, which is not ideal.
Yeah, and that was always the interesting item. And I see the poll starting to get populated. So feel free, put 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in the chat. Always curious. And I think to your point, Russ, that is a good observation. Is usually when you think about it, it's like, oh, we're going to review it after something happens, right? The incident or something along those lines. It's like, sometimes organization dusts off the playbook and, okay, this is what we were supposed to do in this item. But was that the real place to start? So I think that's a good area to kind of dive into. My thought process as well is I would love monthly from that standpoint of just reviewing, hey, is this still good with the teams and things? Perfect world, right? It's like, hey, everything is working right and we want to improve, we want to enhance. All right, let's go from there. But how often do we see it in practice? To your point, Russ. So
yeah,
often good
definitely.
questions. And I think one of the other items that you can start to go through, and somebody said every week. So that would be an interesting thing to review our architecture every week. That'd be great.
I would love it. That would be great.
Yeah, right. So that is a good place to start. Just every week. Let's work backwards from that, and just put a bunch of meetings on the calendar as well to go along with that. That would be fun. So
weekly architecture review.
Yeah, exactly. So I think to carry on this point, and feel free to keep putting the numbers in the chat or saying what your favorite extreme sport is or saying hello and where you're dialing in from. But I think to kind of continue on with what we were just speaking about is we have our castle and we're trying to build it and trying to expand, fortify, and all that good stuff. And I think that's where this episode really starts to come into play and shine. Because in today's episode, to your point, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the advanced security architecture. And you may say, hey, what is that? Well, we're going to start to speak about something like IAM at scale. So maybe we have something like ABAC that we want to talk about. Or we could go to the other side, sophisticated threat detection, extending GuardDuty, or encryption, or there's a lot, CIA triad. There's a lot that we can dive into. So I know in a lot of castle-based video games, it's always dangerous to go alone and you need a guide. So I think in, let's say, Legend of Zelda terms, we need a sage. So I think part of that sagedom, I think, comes with our guests that we're going to have on today. And I think it's time to bring him to the forefront and add and welcome James. How's it going, James?
Going good. Good morning, gentlemen.
James, how's it going?
Yeah, thank
This
you.
is the true sage. I bow
Yeah.
down to your sage stone.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe an adjacent adventurer. I don't know about true sage, but I definitely try.
Yeah, I saw the aura coming off of you when I brought you on, so that's part of it, right? But James, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from?
So I've been with AWS for about 3 years now. My previous roles were in the software architecture side, specifically on security architecture. So I was in the industrial IoT space, and it really mattered that you did a very advanced security, right? And so you were talking about security reviews earlier. I think with all the various teams that I ran, we would do you'd end up with one about a week, but it was dependent on what team was doing what. So anytime you changed something, you did a security architecture review, or anytime you were designing new systems, you did architecture reviews, or to your point, Russ, anytime something happened, you did additional architecture reviews, right? So it's a lot of experience on that side, tons of threat modeling, red team, blue team assessments, making sure that you kind of fine tune all of your security details. So a lot of that in my career, let's just say that.
A little bit of everything, right?
Yeah.
But I would say the most important question that everybody in the chat is waiting for is, when it comes to extreme sports, what is your favorite extreme sport?
Oh, well, I think the last time I was on with Shannon, we got pretty deep into it. So extreme sports is kind of my thing. I got a motorcycle, skydiving, rock climbing, snowboarding. Russ, I did snowboarding last weekend with my son. I'm pretty avid at all those, but my favorite one is probably rock climbing. There's nothing like being 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet off the tarmac, looking down. One of my favorite spots is just 2 hours south of here. I live in northern Nevada, so we're just out of Yosemite. So you just drive down to Yosemite, do big wall Yosemite rock climbs on the weekends, and it's a lot of fun.
That all sounds great.
Yeah.
So,
I was gonna ask rock climbing or bouldering, but then you said 1,000 feet up, and that kind of answered that question. So.
Bouldering.
Yeah.
I do what's called trad climbing, which is traditional climbing. So there's trad climbing, sport climbing, and then bouldering. Sport climbing is where they have bolts in the wall and just kind of clip in. Trad climbing is you have things like what's called cams or nuts or hex bolts. You put it into the wall, you clip into it, then you climb up a little bit, you do a little bit more, and then you usually have a partner down below that climbs up after you and collects it. So you go up 200 feet, collect, up 200 feet, collect, and you kind of make your way all the way up the mountainside.
and the first question I have is, so if we're not doing 1,000 feet and we kind of scale back, where do you start with that? I need a good about 10-foot wall.
Start with a rock climbing gym that has a nice little bouldering section off to the side. And then if you want to get interested in more rock climbing type of stuff, they have what's called tuck ropes. So they hook a rope to you, you climb up, and someone's watching you, and you come back down nice and easy.
Yeah. Nice and easy. That's what I like. And I think I'll stay right there.
Yeah.
It's the opposite.
Sign up for
side
that
of
one.
Yeah, right. I'll start a rock climbing class that says nice and easy, right? That's how you get everybody in the door. So with that, I think that also sets us up perfectly to talk about kind of the advanced concepts and talking about walls, the basic walls that we need when we're fortifying our castle. So if we have that in place, so what should we do? How do we do it? Where do we go? And I pass it to you, James.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about basic walls, it always comes down to, like, you probably talked about this last time because you were talking about the fundamentals, right? It's really defining your threat landscape on your security architecture for your network design, right? So it's understanding the inputs and the outputs, who can get in, who can get out, how people can get between your different layers. And then you think about a defense in depth type of strategy is you want a public VPC as well as private VPCs, where all your more secure things are much more controlled and lower level controlled subnets, and your public stuff is a little bit more accessible to the outside world. But it's really making sure that you're defining those layers and that perimeter. That perimeter is the most important thing in terms of who can get in and who can get out.
Yeah, you definitely bring up a couple of points that we were speaking about before in terms of just that layered defense in depth approach. So for those who were here last week, we talked about those fundamental pieces. And James brought up some good points on how we can continue to pour the the concrete or put rocks or however they used to do it. So the next piece is, what is the next step with that? So if we're talking about the castle, now we start to build out maybe, let's say, our secret tunnels, right? If we go online and we said the catchphrase. So you talked about something from the endpoint standpoint. So
Sure.
can you expand upon like VPC endpoints and private links and things of that nature?
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects you got to think about, right? Is external connection inward, like how do you get out from the outside to the inside, and those would be like your VPNs and your primary tunnels to get access into the network securely. So that gives you a nice controlled pipeline to get in where nobody else can kind of interrupt what you're doing. And then you talk about endpoints inside the VPC. That's how do I do even more controlled access between two specific services or two specific like pieces of software that I wrote, or between two different systems that need access to each other. I don't want to give unlimited access. I want very specific targeted access. And I want to start defining those relationships between all the different components in my network so that you can, again, reduce the surface area of what's possible to attack because you're doing very targeted connections between things.
Yeah, that's definitely a good approach to it. Is kind of going to that concept of least privilege. I always like to say it as many times so I can hear the other people on the other side of the internet feel me say it. So when we say the least privilege and the layered approach and having endpoints, and that goes to a variety of the different AWS services, right? Sure. When we talk about S3 and all these different items, is okay, who has access to these different pieces? And that is a great question. And I think if we had weekly security architecture reviews, we could, figure out all those different pieces. I would think, Russ, what else should we consider? What do you think?
So in theme with our episode today and secret passages, so I guess I'm kind of thinking more along the lines of things that we're trying to keep hidden. So like in this case, like credentials or keys, key management. So really just wondering about I guess like KMS and how you can kind of utilize that in your security architecture.
So when you think about KMS, it's usually, there's different aspects of it. Let's back up a little bit and think about what you're trying to encrypt, because anytime you start talking about keys, you're talking about hiding data, right? And so typically there's your connection between things, that's your secure communication, and then you mentioned S3, Tristan, right? That's data at rest. So that could be S3, an object store, that could be EBS volumes for your magnetic or your chip-based storage platform, solid state devices. Or that could be data that you're storing inside of a database somewhere. There's a lot of different places that you have to consider where your data is and what you're trying to store and what you're trying to keep secure and safe. And so KMS keys is a set of encryption keys that you can apply to different things. So I can apply them to a bucket in the S3 case, where I encrypt all the data on the bucket, and only the person that has the key can read that data. And then when you talk about connection between places, those are usually certificate-based communication. So again, you have your private key and your public key in terms of decrypting and encrypting that traffic, but that would be transport layer security, which all of the AWS endpoints now support. So TLS 1.3 is available all across AWS. And so you really want to define what types of keys are important to your business. Now you have Amazon defined keys, so you can use KMS with Amazon, or you can do customer managed keys, which is bringing in your own key material. Now, a lot of people ask, like, which one should I use and which one is better? Yeah, there's not really a better use case. It's much more of, it depends on what your use case is in and what your requirements are. So a lot of people have, let's say, government requirements. They're doing FedRAMP High or some other type of regulatory compliance standard. Well, each of those regulatory compliance standards have targets that you have to hit, checkboxes, right? And so if you don't have a requirement for a customer managed key material, it all just stays inside of your AWS environment. If you have that external need to bring in and manage your own key life cycles, those are where KMS keys come in, where customers are managing those key materials. But then you got to think about the different access layers. So talking about a little bit more advanced, if something's in your AWS environment, the permissions inside your AWS environment determines who has access to that key material or who doesn't. If you're bringing key material externally into your environments, well, now you have to worry about those external systems that are holding your customer managed key materials and how you're actually storing them externally to AWS. So those are other security considerations outside of the cloud that you might need to now start considering if that's your kind of chosen path. So there's pros and cons on both ways. And I know a lot of different experts in the industry have their own opinions on which is better and for what reasons. But there are pros and cons when you're thinking about anything, and it comes always back to use cases and requirements.
Yeah, that's definitely an important point to make, is not all or one size fits all in that kind of phrase, because you really have to look and work backwards from one of the requirements, and that starts to form your target state security strategy, right? So how you're using keys, like, okay, is there a requirement that we need, whether it be PCI or something along those lines? It's like, oh, you must be FIPS 140-2, level 3, all those good things, right? So you have to identify that within your environment. So those are really good points from that standpoint. And there's also the good point of just saying, hello, Samson.
Yes.
And also, hello, thank you for joining in. Feel free to keep saying hello and just continuing the conversation, just like this, where Andy says, curious, please help understand AWS web services industry and why it's important. I think that is a good question, just from the standpoint of just, hey, what are you trying to accomplish within your organization? What are you trying to accomplish within your business? And AWS and the infrastructure is one of the ways that you are trying to help achieve that goal, right? So from our standpoint, we're coming from security standpoint, but you're trying to work backwards from your outcomes of, hey, I want to have the best, if we deviate from the financial piece, and I want to have the best lotion or cream or something along those lines. I want to get it to as many customers as possible. How do I do that? Oh, I want a website. Oh, what is the website hosted on? Oh, maybe we can use infrastructure as code to help bring up a website. We can use S3. There's a bunch of different ways. But where we come from is, how do we secure all of that to make sure that the transactions that are getting processed are secure, that the communication to other vendors, the API interactions, all of that is in place. So thank you for that question. It's a good way to, start off these discussions as we're talking about, hey, we have castles. Why do we have the castle? Well,
something else to think about in relation to that, right, is the security landscape over the last couple of decades has changed pretty radically. It used to be air gap networking. It used to be, on-prem security servers and making sure that only people that in a data center had a key to things. But the cloud has matured a lot in the last 10 years. And so many security services are just natively built in that you didn't have access to, or from a software engineering side of perspective, it would take so many extra engineering hours to implement some of these things. But because the cloud already kind of delivers those pieces for you, you don't have to worry about building them. You just turn them on and you get all the benefits of the industry best practices across the board. And so, we do see natural swings in the industry. I mean, you go back all the way to the 1980s. Swings to server base, swings to data centers, swing to cloud, swing to data centers, swing back to cloud. So I'm sure there will be swings in the future. There always are, but it's much more right now. The cloud, the biggest benefits of the cloud is just those native secure infrastructures, so that you can worry about your business and what you want to do with the cloud technologies, rather than the security of the data that you're storing on the cloud. That's more natively built in, a couple easy checkboxes to turn on and get those benefits.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of goes back full circle to the encryption conversation. Do you do the managed keys or the CMKs? Right? It's all of that. Is how much do you want to do in terms of automation? And I know we spoke about in previous episodes when it came to generative AI, and that was a big item of how do you want to implement generative AI within your environment and the levels and all those kind of things. But I digress with that. Russ, I think, do we have another poll, Russ?
Yes, we should have another poll that we're going to pop up. So for this poll, which advanced defense mechanism interests you the most? Private network architectures, custom security automations, advanced WAF implementations, multi-account security controls. Ooh, that's a good one. Let's see what the chat has to say. Based off of that, we'll kind of maybe ask some questions to James related to whatever chat decides to come up with.
Yeah.
Custom security automations first on the list.
It's up there. Custom. Make sure everything works. A bunch of lambdas triggering step functions and all that good stuff. That is a tempting one, number 2 right there. So it's interesting as well as multi-account security controls. I might lean towards that as well from my perspective, just from talking with different customers, especially within the financial services field where they have so many accounts, they have so many organizations, and they need security controls, and they need non-prod and prod environments, the full life cycle for multiple organizations, right? So how do you, and I think this goes to kind of expanding the castle walls, how do we go from one castle to multiple castles in a secure manner? So it's a tough one for me with 4. But I'm curious, everybody in the chat, put 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we have advanced WAF. Hey, financial service needed per regulatory requirements. That is a good point. Thank you for bringing it up. So a lot
that
of
does oh, sorry about that. But that does bring up a good point, is that kind of a theme that I'm seeing that we're discussing is that, like your infrastructure and what you're trying to do, security is very contextual. So I mean, you know, if you are a financial service, then you would probably be more interested in advanced WAF implementations because that's directly related to you. So a lot of these, there we go. A lot of these are going to be very contextual, and even some of the recommendations or what, you know, method or strategy you want to go with is all just so contextual based on your infrastructure and what you're trying to do. And like you were saying, Tristan, there's no one size fits all solution for security.
Yep. And then
I think coming back to WAF implementations, because it looks like we got a couple people with those interesting or that are leaning that direction, right? Is it depends on what use cases and what you're trying to do, right? What types of traffic are you trying to block? What threat actors are imposing risks in your industry? And you know, I'm not super financial with the financial services industry. I'm more on the ISV space, but it's, you know, it's really coming back to those use cases. What are you trying to block against? What are you trying to protect against? You know, there's a lot of different strategies for analyzing the traffic that you are seeing and understanding the different types of threat actors that are attacking your application firewalls. That, you know, that's why we have a collection of different types of rules that you can apply depending on the types of bad actors that you're seeing. So there's a lot of different things that you can turn on and turn off depending on those threat actors and what types of issues you need to protect against.
Yeah, and a lot of different mechanisms for governance, right? Where if you think of something like Firewall Manager, and it's just like, all right, we're going to have this do security groups and WAF, or maybe we just use it for WAF management as you start to grow, and it kind of goes in conjunction with everything, right? With the multi-account and the custom security automations. So a lot of different points.
There's a lot of things you have to consider. I was talking to a customer where they had a situation where they had a bunch of traffic that they were trying to detect. So they sent out all these web links for surveys, and they needed to detect bot traffic that was coming back in through the firewall, because they ended up with a whole bunch of surveys that were giving them answers that didn't make any sense. But they had special case use cases where people would go run a training class, and then the instructor would hand out the survey tag. And all at once, from a single set of IP addresses, they'd have like 1,000 surveys from a single set of IP addresses. And they had to be able to detect the difference between those types of events with 1,000 known, you know, actually good survey responses to, you know, thousands of potential bots. So they had to tweak their rules and have some pretty sophisticated metric logic to determine what they blocked and what they didn't block and how their firewall was responding to that. So there's a lot of, again, it always comes back to use cases. Like, what are the concerns? What are you blocking against? Is it bot traffic? Is it threat actors? What's going on there, right?
Yeah, definitely 100%. And somebody says F5. Whatever security mechanisms that adds to your defense in depth approach. And multi-account continues to fascinate me, and I'm enjoying seeing more and more narrative support added each year. Well, I'm glad that we can have this conversation because, well, let's add to the narrative, because that's how we find out, hey, what is everybody else doing? And that's kind of where we're trying to look and identify, because as a collective, right, we help to go on these adventures together and say, hey, this is the route. This is how you attack this issue or this problem or this gap within your organization. And it's a lot easier to take a strategy guide with you, right? When you go into boss battles, if we keep with the video gaming theme. So, yeah.
So, speaking about that multi-account strategy stuff, the fun part is if you go back 3 to 5 years, we didn't really have a great set of capabilities in AWS for that multi-account story, right? It's just we were designed much more around single accounts. Some customers were using a lot of multi-accounts, but we didn't have the tools around it. But AWS organizations has grown a lot in the last several years. And just recently, if folks aren't aware, we have MFA required on all accounts now. We have AWS organizations that allows you to, manage your root accounts across all of your organizations. You think about the service control policies that you can do at an OU level. So it gives you really fine-grained control about this organizational unit is allowed to do these things. This organizational unit is allowed to do these things. And that really gives you a lot of benefit to say, I can, to your point earlier, Tristan, right, is I have a series of accounts that are my developer accounts. I want those to be a little bit more open in terms of the types of services people can use, but I want it a little bit more controlled in terms of which regions they're able to deploy stuff in versus a production account. I want it completely locked down. I want anything in this OU with these SCPs, only these regions, only these services, only this level of control. And you're doing that across your accounts, across the entire organization at the same time. So there's a lot of nice tools that are available. And there's, AWS organizations have done a lot of plugins, health dashboards across all of your organizations for security alerts. So you get those alerts all in a single account. Security Hub now does across all your organizations. So if you're trying to get alerting across all of your security concerns with Security Hub, you can get it organization wide. So there's a lot of really good organizational wide considerations that are beautiful for multi-account, right?
Yeah, definitely. And even talking about the growth, RCP policies or resource control policies that just recently came out. That's another big one. And Robert Tables here mentions organizational tag policies. That's how you maintain your sanity. I would agree. Tag everything,
Yep.
Please. Right. So, with that being said, I would also mention.
Sorry.
I was just going to mention to subscribe, follow, all those good things. We're here every week in order to talk about these different items and dive into these little nuances. But I think it also sets the stage for something else. And what that something else is, I take the dramatic pause. I take a second. I take a breath. I would take a sip. But the most important thing is, right? We have a title. We have a theme. So that means we have a side quest. So I start to put in my voice into the little bit of a D&D, a little bit of movie of announcer. So as side quest legend has it, is a section that we want to dive into next. And what might that be is, well, we continue our customer story. So in this legend that we're continuing, we're returning to our cloud practitioner from last week, who was once new to the concepts of the cloud, the ways of the cloud. But now, after a couple of side quests, they have leveled up. They feel a little bit more confident. They have a little bit more gear. And they also have a coffee subscription. But, however, they are faced with the next challenge. And what is that next challenge? Well, as you continue to grow, they're starting in the startup world. But what is the next step for the startup? Well, it's maybe going towards a mid-size company or even larger, depending on how fast growth is. So why is that important? Well, in the realm of startup, based on what we were talking about, multi-account strategies and things of that nature start to come into play. So what we have to do is carve out and bring to the stage our side quest board. And we have our great 3 adventurers today, or I should say 2 adventurers in 1 stage, as we delve into the understanding and mapping out and charting out the path of our individual who's a little bit wiser now, all the way to the next step of the AWS environment. So I think part of the conversation we have to talk about and start off with is we're going from a startup to a mid-size. What is the journey like for that? And maybe I'll put this right here. It's not a straight path. It's always a curved path. And the reason why I say that is because, hey, what is the context we're coming from? Well, as the company continues to grow, the more governance, the more scaling that is needed. So I pose this question to our local sage, James. Have you seen or watched or heard somebody experience the scaling of AWS security practices from company startup to midsize?
Absolutely, right. And a lot of the concerns in there is you think about multi-account access. Customers usually have 1 or 2 accounts or maybe 10 accounts, and they have everything defined in IAM, right? But then they start scaling across their organization a little bit more, and other teams start using AWS, and they have a little bit more need of scaling up the services. How do you get access to people and make sure, again, you're following those least privilege mechanisms in place? And so typically you got to start with what type of an SSO provider, single sign-on provider, are you using, or an IDP, an identity provider?
Yes, I think that's a good place to start. Identity. That's one of the main pieces of the puzzle. And I also pose this chat, I would say, is how many of you have experienced the scaling of AWS security best practices as your company grew from a startup to a midsize? And if we continue this train of thought, as we head down our path as adventurers and say identity is one of the pieces that we consider, and somebody says identity center, great. And the next piece, I am as notorious as the great. If you could speak more about this. So if we stay on this piece, maybe let's talk about some of the challenges that come, because this is a perfect area to expand upon. Because when you grow with your infrastructure from a startup, identity starts to become a item that is discussed, and we can start to talk about authentication and privileged access management, all of those things, and governance at scale. James, what do you say from there?
You think back to security architecture and designing things a specific way, right? I think somebody in the chat earlier mentioned tag policies or tagging things. You need to understand that you want to move away from item-based access to a role-based access. So a lot of times people get started early, and they create access keys, and they give people roles within their organization, and they're attaching inline policies to everything. But now as you start scaling, you need to figure out, well, what are general policies? What are general roles? Do I have a general development role? And how do I start limiting access between all of my different resources to those roles? Do I need to tag roles with team tags, so I can tag resources with a specific team and then a single developer role that only gives access to the team you're on, to the resources that are assigned to your team? So now you're talking about what's called ABAC, or attribute-based access control, and role-based access control. So you need to define the high-level roles within your organization that you want, and you want to define the attributes that kind of define what people have access to. But you got to be careful, because people tend to go overboard, and they want to create too many roles, or too many policies, or too many attributes. So you got to, you can get yourself in a lot of danger if you take or trouble. It's a murky swamp out there where you're digging your staff into to see how deep the water is. You want to make sure that it's deep enough to meet what you need, so you have a path across the swamp, but it's not too deep where all of a sudden you get mired in all these extra data and extra attributes that just kind of make your organization stuck. So typically what you want to do is you want to say, look, we're shifting from a single set of roles and access keys to role-based policy. We want to use Identity Center and potentially other IDPs like Okta, or let's say you have Azure, you're coming from a Microsoft shop, so Entra ID. You want to bring those in. So you bring those users in, and now you can define high-base roles that each of those users have, or those groups have. So you have groups defined in your IDP. These are my business users. These are my developers. These are the admins. And you want to give the admins a little bit wider breadth, but you want very controlled access for all of your other groups. And then as people start logging in, you can start defining what attributes need to be determined for what additional resources in the accounts they should have control over. So it's really building a strategy and a plan on how that looks like for your organization. And as you get to mid-scale, you also want to start looking ahead. Like, if we scale twice this size, does this strategy still work, so that we don't have to do a lot of refactoring later on? how can we put the minimum implementation for potentially large scale growth later on, especially as you start getting into that middle growth. You go from 2 to 5 accounts to 10 accounts to 20 accounts to 50 accounts to 100 accounts to 1,000 accounts. What's that strategy look like throughout your business life cycle?
Yeah. And then the other piece to add is the timing. So if you have all these users and they have the access, how long do they have that access? And you start to get into the just-in-time access attributes and things of that nature, because that's often a question where you might have a manager that grants access to somebody and maybe, hey, how long do they need that access? And that's a conversation that needs to be had within the organization as they're planning out their whole identity security posture, because you don't want somebody to have access forever. You want temporary access. So those are the conversations that we like to have. And if we continue on our adventure, so we brought up the point of identity, and we brought up, let's say, governance. What are some other maybe solutions that may come into play as we start to head down the path of identity? So we currently have this as a big piece. So it's kind of a short path as of right now, but is it? Because the mechanism that we start to get into is understanding maybe some of the logging items. And I know you can't exactly see it, but I'll put CloudWatch down face up in discussion mode to say, hey, what do we do from, let's say, a logging as we're starting to look at advanced security mechanisms? What is some of the logging considerations that we should have?
That's a great question. I think visibility is key to success, right? You want to know who's logging in, when they're logging in, what they're accessing. You also want to look for anomalies. If somebody's trying to log into something multiple times and they're failing all the time, how do you get notified about that, right? So you're looking for areas that people aren't necessarily following the right behavior, or outliers, but you can't do any of that unless you have logging enabled. And so I think the key starting point is make sure logging is enabled across all of your environments. And we typically talk to customers specifically about, make sure you have CloudWatch enabled, CloudTrail enabled across all your environments. Maybe make sure you have an organization trail. Make sure you have a single login account, so all your logs go to the same place. Because if it's dispersed across your organization, and then you got to implement rules all over your organization. If it's all in a single account in a single place, then you have a single spot to put your rules and your anomaly detection and your outliers. And then, now that you're logging a lot of things, it's important. The nice thing about CloudWatch is you can do events with EventBridge, and you can create, responses to things. A lot of my customers typically they track those specific outliers that they're looking for. Let's say an excessive number of failed logins. Who do they notify on that? Do they notify the security team? Do they notify the application team? Do they notify, somebody on management so that the CISO can get involved if they care about those types of notifications? But you're trying to build mechanisms that allowed you to identify the data, and then additional mechanisms that allow you to respond to the data. And the response is just as important as the detection, because you can detect all day long, and many customers turn on, CloudTrail and CloudWatch, but then they don't follow through with the mechanisms for notifying people. And you got to be careful about that too, because you don't want the notifications to go into a mailbox for the security team that nobody ever reviews, because that happens, right? Now it's great to go back to your point, Russ, when you normally show up, you're like, oh, great, we can go investigate what happened. But it would have been so much nicer if people were responding to that before you needed to get involved, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think part of that is also having something like Security Hub to centralize all those different pieces, right? We're getting all these logging sources. We have CloudTrail, VPC flow logs, GuardDuty logs, all these items. I think part of the automation strategy, if I play to James's early point of the custom automations, is having something like Security Hub in place, right? And then we compare that with our target state security strategy that eventually gets us to the place of understanding how to secure our AWS environment. And just to recap really quick, is we have our authenticated user. We talked about identity, and then we went into a logging and centralized logging conversations, because if you have something like Control Tower, you have a login archiving account, things of that nature. But to speed run this really quick and go through the security hub, identifying if you have those regulatory requirements, PCI, things of that nature, best practices. You want to have those in place. And then eventually, these are not all the items, but they are some of the items that are of legend. I think what we have to also do is quickly hit the Zach Morris timeout button and say, pause the game. I think bring us back out a little bit as we start to talk about, hey, what else do we need to consider? What else do we need to know? And I think what I'll do is kind of expand upon some of the items that you were saying, James. Is we talked about identity. What about cross-account security patterns and things of that nature? What would your suggestions be there?
In terms of what specifically?
So you talked about, let's say, SCPs and AWS organizations. You talk maybe RAM. That's another path to talk about resource access management. So those are the type of things that maybe as you start to build up your security walls, other pieces of the puzzle that we need to consider. So.
Yeah, I think, security is super broad. So you got to be careful. Again, you're identifying your use cases and making sure that you're working backwards directly to the use cases that customers are trying to solve and what problems that matter. But in terms of, I think we covered a good general security landscape. The next thing is what about specific application level security, right? So we've secured our landscape, we've built our castles, we've set the outliers. So in terms of setting the guardians on the wall, right? And so we have the wall and we have the people, the watchtower up above, and the guards are kind of watching what's going on. So that's back to, how do you limit who has access to what? Again, least privilege, right? And so SCPs are a great way to achieve least privilege because there's a lot of different mechanisms within SCPs that apply to your entire account or your entire organization. So you can set them at the organization level, and then you can set them at the individual OU level. So organizational unit. So as you start growing your business, you want to organize your business into a lot of different subgroups because you want different rules to apply to each of these different subgroups, right? And so you might have at the highest level, an SCP that says you're only allowed to use these specific regions, and maybe out of the 400 types of services that we have, you limit it to 200 services that you want to manage at the organization level. And then in your production accounts versus your testing accounts versus your developer accounts, you can start specifying different subsections. But the thing is that we got to realize is a lot of customers have different products in different sets of accounts. So even in your production environments, you want that fine-grained control of saying this environment should only have access to these things because those are the only things that this product needs. So if you have a specific set of products and they're using, let's say you have RDS and you have S3 and you have EC2 or EKS or whatever your container or VM based architecture, you want to limit your exposure to only those services that people are allowed to use. Because typically what we have is threat actors come in, they survey what they have access to, and if they have access to too much, then they start using all those other things. We've had people do crypto mining in other regions that you're not paying attention to because they have access to the services and the regions that you don't pay attention to, and then you get a very large bill at the end of that you have to take care of. So then it comes into is there mechanisms that you can put in place to prevent your billing or getting billing alerts as you understand what the types of accounts should be doing, and large increases in cost start popping up in random places. You want to pay attention to those very carefully to make sure that, is it something that your team is doing or something that a threat actor is doing inside of your environment?
Yeah. And the other part is just going along with billing is preventative controls. I think that's a big part is, hey, if you reach your limit, how do we stop this from happening? Because you may have, let's say, a dev environment where they want to play around with something, but they may not shut it down. And that person may go on vacation. And then all of a sudden, hey, there's a big bill that comes. So all good parts of the puzzle. And I guess, Russ, from your standpoint, when it comes to some of the advanced concepts, the custom GuardDuty findings, things of that nature, security hub insights from the incident response side of the house, what's kind of some of the advanced items that you would think of when it comes to that, building up our castle?
Yeah. So I'm not going to beat the cross-account security, beat that drum anymore, even though I really want to. But I do think that there's a lot to be said for each of those things, custom GuardDuty findings, even if you're adding a couple that are related to your environment, like I was saying earlier, security is so contextual. So having those additional added context for GuardDuty, is excellent. And then, looking at event bridge patterns. I could go on a whole episode about why that's useful and the different things that you can do with that. And then Security Hub is kind of your C2, your command and control center, kind of running basically the whole show. So, I think these services, but the actual, strategies behind them, are extremely important, and kind of got to build together to get that kind of defense in depth strategy is really, taking pieces from all of them. If I can real quick, throw in my opinion, so long as you have, plans in place and ideas of what to do in certain situations, like James, like you were saying earlier, like, okay, you've got the notification, now what? And it's like, you have to have those plans thought out before they happen in order for those to really be useful. So same thing with security architecture. What are you doing with your security? Yeah, exactly. You got the security reference architecture right here. So what are you doing? What are you looking to do? What are you trying to find? What does your business or industry face specifically? So there's a lot of things that we go over, but it feels like it's kind of, D all of the above.
I think you mentioned a good point, Russ, which is security is a journey, right? You can't get everything done today, and especially since the goal is going from a startup to the next set of steps to hopefully a much larger organization over time. You can't get everything all at the beginning. It's really what makes the most sense. Where's your biggest risk? And that's why I like Security Hub, because it also helps you prioritize your risks. And you really want to take a look at the top risks that you have and remediate those first before you move on to the next set of risks, right? Ruthless prioritization, as I say, against your biggest risk should be your primary targets.
Exactly. And just having that kind of roadmap in your head of the crawl, walk, run stage. Because when you look at something like the security reference architecture, it's a good starting point, but it might be overwhelming if you're just coming into it from startup and growing your organization. Maybe like, hey, there's a lot of services and there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle. And I think that's why we like to throw in the section called Knowledge Quest. And what is Knowledge Quest? Well, Knowledge Quest is when we talk about some of the different pieces of how you can level up yourself, your architecture, and just your overall knowledge of AWS, especially when it comes to strengthening your castles. And these are kind of, I want to say homework assignments. I want to say side quests almost, because there's different levels to it. When you think about, let's say the level 100, it's the security architecture of just going through, understanding what perimeter security is within your organization and how does it pertain to me, forensics, things of that nature. And once you have that understanding, maybe you could start to say, hey, I have these mechanisms in place. How can I start to, let's say, automate these different pieces? And then this kind of goes to and starts to talk about automated security response on AWS. It's a good part to jump off with, right? So a lot of pieces of the puzzle to consider, but also I think, hey, how do we get this to the next level? As I cut out for a second, but how do we get this to the next level? We start to think about the L200 steps. And I think this, to James's earlier point, and probably can speak to is from, let's say, the threat modeling aspect. I think threat modeling is the next step of the puzzle, right? When we start to think of, all right, I have all these workloads. What can go right? What can go wrong? And what services are we using? And there's a workshop on this that you can start to go through from that perspective. So I open this to Russ or James. Have you performed any threat modeling builder workshops or led some sessions when it comes to introduction to threat modeling or advanced? So
I mean, I will start. Yes. So, we have a good compliance session that we run at Reinforce and Reinvent every single year, and we talk about compliance and threat modeling in those sessions as well. And for me, threat modeling is the biggest key insights into understanding those work or those use cases that we talked about earlier, right? How do you work backwards? Well, you have to create a threat model. So you have to understand what your requirements are. You have to understand what your regulatory, goals and outcomes are. And then you have to understand what your system is trying to do. And to understand that third one, that's threat modeling. And so whatever services you're using, however you want to structure your architecture, it really allows you to identify all the moving pieces, all the different forms of communication, and what the potential risks are around every single stage of your architecture. And so the beautiful part about doing threat modeling right is by the time you're done, you have this very clear list of security controls that you need to put in place to protect yourself, your organization, your business, your workload, and your customers the best possible way. And then, just as I said before, ruthlessly prioritize. And the nice thing about AWS and a lot of our services is many of those, like KMS keys and such, are just checkboxes. Make sure it's enabled. You mentioned infrastructure as code earlier, Tristan, right? Make sure infrastructure as code is automatically deploying those security checks across the way so that it's just an easy way to enforce it across all of your deployments. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Russ. Go ahead.
I mean, not really. You kind of went over that, but yeah, it's just the threat model is just making a plan. So just you can't do anything without making a plan and thinking it through first. So
yeah,
definitely.
And I think that takes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Real quick, I just wanted to add that it's also just because you did a threat model once doesn't mean like you're done with threat modeling. Like it's like security; it evolves as you go.
I was running regular application teams. Every team lead was responsible for doing a threat model every release, every time something changed. So threat modeling should be a regular part of people's process.
Absolutely.
Yep. And I think to also cap us off is level 300 work is, okay, how can I start to make my pipeline a little bit more secure? What can I integrate? This is one of the workshops that you can go into. I am access analyzer in your pipeline. How can this be important? And how can this be a bigger piece of your puzzle? I think is an important part to consider. And a lot of, I would say, deep diving. And that's why this is Knowledge Quest, where you can dive deep on your own and tell us on LinkedIn or your favorite social media platform of your choice. We'd like to know. And did you complete these workshops? Did you go down the path of understanding? Did you understand what it takes to get to that next level as an adventure as you go from, hey, I'm a startup to maybe I'm a multi-account organization and all those things in between? And I think James and Russ did a really great job of just outlining all these different items and the path that we need to take. And based on the time we have left, I think it's important for us to take a couple of side quests and also to thank James for coming out and being our sage. Security is a broad topic, so take a guide. And that's what James did today as we delved into that. And thank you for everybody to joining us today. And I would also say, have a great rest of your day. I think this closing out is with those last words from Russ and James. Any last bits and pieces of information as we have a couple of seconds left on the clock?
Have an incident response plan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Incident response plans are important. 100%. Security should never be an afterthought. Security should always be something that you consider as you're designing stuff from the beginning.
Yes. And that's a good note to end on. And I take that as a challenge for everybody to go out and do, as we're at time now. So join us next Monday as we talk about how to get our power level a little bit over 9,000. What I mean is that some automation talk. So until next time, thank you and have a great rest of your day. Happy Monday, right? Take care.
Bye.
And this is the